I'm going to pause this evening from our studies of the achievements of Christ, and the reason for that is because as this is the week of prayer, I believe that it's important for me to encourage all of you to be a part in that week where we set aside and we pray. And as we have our week of prayer, I hope that it will start a desire and our enthusiasm, and not just to meet once a year, but to meet on a regular basis, that we would all see the importance of corporate prayer. That means prayer coming together as a group of Christians. We know that prayer is very important in our own individual and in our own personal lives, but it's also important to pray as a body. Remember a number of years ago when, to encourage us, we turned to the book of Acts chapter 12, and this was the early Christian church who met together for prayer, and that is set before us as an example. But I thought this evening we should turn to the book of Joshua chapter 7. Now, in lots of ways, this is a very disturbing passage, and you might start to think, well, what's this got to do with the week of prayer? I do believe that it's also one of the saddest stories in the whole of the Bible. And as it's a very sad story, and there doesn't seem to be much emphasis on the importance of prayer, you would probably be thinking, well, why talk about this tragic event in this story? Why talk about Israel's failure? But Israel's failure was this: they did not pray. They did not inquire of the Lord. And as a consequence, they took the Lord for granted. And they forgot the vital ingredient to what is the most important thing of all: my relationship with God and my relationship with the Lord, and the importance of self-examination. What I mean by self-examination, we mean that we look at ourselves and we ask ourselves lots of searching questions as to see if my relationship with God is in tune, and also if my relationship with one another in tune. Now, this passage is a reminder to all of us what will happen if we don't pray. You see, whatever you do, choices you make, is vital that first of all you pray about it. Usually for many Christians and many churches it's the other way round. When a decision has been made, you realize halfway through that you've forgotten the most important thing of all, and that's to stop and pray. Or when you realize that you've made a mistake, and it's all because you haven't prayed, and you hope that God will get you out of this mess. Now, I believe that it's important that we turn to this passage because we need God's wisdom, and we need God's guidance. We long for a blessing in this church, don't we? We have a desire, we have a vision, we have a burden for evangelism, we have a concern for the health of the local church here, and we need to pray that God will lead us. We also need to see that we need to remind God that we are deadly serious about our role as Christians. And that's why we need to pray first. Remember yesterday I was talking to a person, and he was talking to me about a football training, and he had a new coach that came into his team, and the first thing that the coach said to him, look, if any of you are serious about this business, and if you're not, well, leave now. Well, that's the point here. We need to ensure that God sees that we mean business. The fact is, in this story in Joshua chapter 7, it's a reminder of the importance of coming and committing ourselves to the Lord. Now, this doesn't make pleasant reading. The story happens under the leadership of perhaps one of Israel's greatest leaders. Of course, that leader was Joshua. And Joshua wasn't just a military genius, but he was also a good, godly, obedient servant of the Lord. Now, they were in the promised land, and Joshua had fulfilled all of God's commands that he was to take various cities and to conquer the land. And the battles that Israel and Joshua went through is a picture of the Christian life, for the Christian life is full of battles and conflicts. Yet we are to conquer. And Israel had a great victory in taking city after city and taking the great city of Jericho. What God had told Joshua and Israel to do was a very unusual thing, to march around the city once for 6 days, and then on the 7th, march around the city for 7 times, and then they were to blow the trumpets and give a loud shout, and the walls of Jericho will come tumbling down. Now, of course, when you read this account, you perhaps might say, well, that's not making a great deal of sense. There doesn't seem to be a lot of logic there. To defeat a city, the powerful city, with these kind of instructions would be laughable. And this is a reminder to all of us that God gives instructions that might seem very unusual to us, yet they are God's instructions, and the reason why they might seem unusual to us is to test our obedience, and to test our faith, and to test our belief that will we obey. And the people of Israel obeyed. And this is what we're told in Joshua chapter 6 and verse 20. And the walls of Jericho collapsed, and the army took the city. And then we're told in verse 24 that Joshua destroyed the whole of the city. And then in verse 27 we're told that the world feared Israel and Joshua. And so we come to chapter 7, and you now can imagine, can't you? The Israelites were now feeling on top of the world. They were feeling confident in themselves. They were confident in their God, and they were confident in their victory. The morale would have been very high. They must have even felt excited now. They must have thought, well, what are we waiting for? Let's get on with the work. Let's move on. Let's take the next city. God has demonstrated his power. Why should we wait? And if that was their spirit, well, there's nothing wrong with that. That was good. And as Christians, we must always work on the success that God has given to us. We know the instructions. Take, for example, evangelism. We know the command. There's really no need for discussion about it, only obedience. Maybe we need to discuss the methods and how you go about it, but at the end of the day, we need to be obedient to the Great Commission that we go out into the world. And that was Israel's task. They were now commanded to take the next city of Ai, and they were right to do so. And so they sent 3,000 men to Ai and take the city, but instead of victory, there was total humiliation. There was defeat. They were routed as seen in verse 4. And in verse 5, 36 men were killed. They were chased out. And we're told in verse 6 that this was humiliation for Joshua, that he tore his clothes, he ripped his clothes, and he fell flat on his face in despair. So then, as we look at this passage, I'm going to ask 4 questions. The first question is this: why was Israel defeated? Well, we answer that in 3 ways. First of all, there's the danger of overconfidence. There's nothing wrong with being confident. There is nothing wrong in having confidence in the power of God There was nothing wrong in having confidence in his ability. In fact, we're called upon to have confidence in God at all times and at all places. Yet the trouble with Israel was that their confidence in God turned around, and it was turned to their own confidence. The victory that they had boasted their confidence to dangerous levels, and that is the danger of overconfidence. You see, this happens in characters, doesn't it? You think of Peter. Remember his self-confidence in that he said to Jesus that he would never deny him, and yet we're told 3 times that he did. And we know what happened next. And as Christians, we need to be aware that one victory is no guarantee that there's going to be another one. Yesterday's victory is no assurance of tomorrow's victory. The danger of overconfidence. Secondly, Israel was defeated because they did not inquire of the Lord. Nowhere are we told that Israel sought the Lord. Nowhere where we're told that Israel got down on their knees and they prayed about it. Had they sought the Lord no doubt would have made it plain and clear to them where the problem lay. Now, that's not to say that it would or wouldn't necessarily be the Lord's will. In other words, people can blame prayer for failure. For example, people can make decisions and they go ahead with these decisions. And if it all goes wrong, well, they say, well, we did pray about it. They will say, well, we did take it to the Lord, and well, what happened? The Lord obviously didn't listen to our prayer. I know a couple who did something like that. They moved to another area and it all went wrong, and it was almost like they were blaming God for the disaster, and they tried to spiritualize it all by saying, but we did pray about it. But Israel couldn't even say that. They couldn't even say, well, we sought God's face in prayer. They went into their own battle, their next battle, on their own strength and on their own ability, without praying about it. Thirdly, Israel was defeated because of one man's sin. Can you imagine Joshua's shock? He and the elders, in verses 6 to 9, did the right thing. They took the matter to the Lord. And yet when God answered them, they were shocked at the Lord's answer, and they were shocked by his reply. Look at verse 10. The Lord said to Joshua, stand up. What are you doing on your face? Why was that a shock? It was a shock for them because they thought that God was going to say to them, there, pat on the back. Don't worry about it. They thought that God was going to come to them in a sympathetic way, like a wet blanket mum to a wet blanket child. There, don't worry about it. They thought that God was going to join in with their self-pity. They were almost blaming God for their defeat. Look at the middle of verse 7. If only we had been content to stay on the other side of the Jordan. Who are they blaming here? They're blaming God. Indirectly, he was saying, if only it allowed us to stay on the other side of the Jordan, so these things wouldn't have happened. So that's why God gives to them short shift. What are you blubbering on about? This is a serious issue. Israel has sinned. Now get up and find out the reason. I found that quite astonishing. In other words, God doesn't wink at sin. Sin corrupts. As sin spreads, as sin possesses. And if it's not dealt with, then the inevitable will happen. there'd be total defeat. The trouble is that some Christians are content to be defeated. It doesn't require much effort or work. And what happens is that that Christian does not progress or develop or grow in their Christian life. But it's our responsibility to pray that God will help us to see why we don't progress and why we're not advancing in our Christian life and why we're not growing and developing. And one of the reasons why Christians and churches do not progress is down to this: lack of prayer. Yet it was Israel's job to find out where the sin was from that God refers to. And God tells them, he makes it very clear in the previous chapter of chapter 6 and verse 19, that all the spoils of war were to go into the temple treasury. And that meant no one can take the spoils for themselves. Yet someone did. And they were to find out who it was. So these were the reasons for Israel's defeat. Let's ask a second question. How shameful was their defeat? Answer: it was totally shameful. To be on the march, to have a great reputation and to be an advanced army throughout the whole of the world, and then suddenly to hear that 36 men had been killed and the army had been chased out was total embarrassment. How shameful. This was a national crisis. This was a national embarrassment. They were red-faced. It was considered to be a national disgrace. I remember once reading of Winston Churchill when he talks about the biggest humiliation that he faced. He'd gone to America to get support from the Americans. He assured Roosevelt that Britain would stand to the last man, where at that point Roosevelt was handed a telegram. He looked at the telegram, and then he looked at Churchill and said, "I think you better read this." And it read that 85,000 British, Australian, Indian troops had surrendered to the Japanese in Singapore. And Churchill said that it was the biggest embarrassment he ever had to face. Well, that was the same for the children of Israel. But you see, that is what sin does. Sin, if caught, is shameful. But worse than that, sin hidden in the sight of God who can see it is even more shameful. All the consequences of sin is shameful and embarrassing. And when we're caught off guard, it's awkward, it's embarrassing. It may be a season of fun, it may be a season of joy, it may be a season of happiness, but it will always come to us crawling on our bellies in shame. A person who's caught red-handed is embarrassed. A person who's caught with his hand in the till and the cameras are pointing at him, he is ashamed, he's embarrassed. And the same with the children of Israel. Their defeat was embarrassing, shameful. But let's ask another question. What does this passage tell us about God? Well, first of all, it tells us that God expects purity in the camp. God expects purity in the community. Or, let's apply it to ourselves, God expects purity in the local church. Look at verse 11. Israel has sinned. He didn't say someone's done a naughty thing. He doesn't say Israel is 99% sinless and 1% isn't. He said the whole of Israel the whole of the community has sinned and been a holy God and sanctified his people, God expects total purity. And this means self-examination needs to be thorough. And when I say self-examination, I do not mean that you start soul-searching for the fellow member of the church or you start soul-searching for others, but you start with yourself. That is where we begin. Ourselves. God expects purity within the camp. Secondly, this passage tells us about God, that God can see right through our hearts and nothing is hidden. When God told Joshua the problem, Joshua the next morning searched tribe by tribe until he discovered that Achan was the guilty one. A sin will always catches up. Very often when people try to hide their sins, they may be successful for a few months or they may be successful for a few years, but it will always come out in the open in the end. God knows our secret sins. God knows our secret thoughts. We may try to hide them from one another. We may be very good at that. We may be very successful in hiding them, but we cannot hide these sins from God. No one, absolutely no one, is exempt from the all-seeing eye of God. All the harboring of grudges that we keep in our heads and hearts. All those times when we're resentful of certain things happening. All those times when we have an unhealthy thought that comes into our mind. God knows all about them. And sometimes we're very good, aren't we, at making excuses, which might sound good on the surface, about going to church. Or we might try and cover it by saying, well, I'm going to the place of prayer. But God knows all about it. The all-seeing eye of God reads our hearts like an open book. I know of a really disturbing case in the Midlands of a pastor who had an affair with a lady in the church for 5 years. No one in the whole church and even in the town or village knew about this affair for 5 years. No one suspected it. Not even the family were suspicious. And when it all came out in the open, the testimony of that church in the area was totally destroyed. And it's for that reason that self-examination is crucial. Thirdly, God sees the church as a unit. Look at verse 5. The hearts of the people melted. Verse 11, Israel has sinned. But in verse 20, it was Achan who had sinned. Now, is that fair? Do you ever wonder sometimes? I remember as a child looking at this passage, why is it fair that one man's sin should affect the whole of the church? Is it fair that one man's disobedience shall cause defeat? But before we answer that, let's remember that this is a reminder to all of us as a responsibility to the body of Christ. We are a unit. We are a body. Remember what Paul says in 1 Corinthians chapter 12 and verse 26. If one part of the body suffers, well, every part of the body suffers. You probably know that I go out running on a regular basis, and one day I was limping away, and there was something that was popping in my foot inside my shoe. So I stopped and I took off my trainers and I shook it, and out came a tiny speck that affected my running. A tiny thing like that affected the whole of the body. And that's what a thorn does. It causes you to limp. And that's the point that God makes. He sees the body as a unit, and we all have a responsibility towards that unit, making sure that our lives are pure, that our lives are in tune with God, and that our relationship with him is all well, because we're all involved in the unit. Sin in the unit can stop growth. Sin in the unit can withhold blessing. Fourthly, this passage tells us that God's judgment is not to be taken lightly. The time had now come for all these sins to be opened. The time had come now for Achan to be exposed, to be brought forward. And you can almost feel Joshua's desperation when, first of all, he said in verse 19, he calls him my son, my son. Why have you done this? Why did Joshua call Achan my son? Could it be that Achan was known in the camp of Israel as a good man? It could be. Could it be that Achan was well respected amongst the people, and therefore Achan was the last person in the world that you'd expect for someone to commit this crime? It happened. The very people that you expect to be firm in their standing are the people who slip. It's always worse when you hear a good man who's done so much for the Lord fallen in this way. Sometimes you'd expect it from certain people, but it could be that you perhaps wouldn't have expected it from Achan. And what does this tell us? It tells us that we all need to be on our guard. And so Achan was brought forward, and he admits that he had taken the sacred things. He admits that he had taken the very thing that belonged to God. But look at the sequence of events that led to his sin. First of all, look at verse 21. When I saw, do you get the point? It always begins with what I see. What I see on TV. Is that healthy? What I see on certain things in my day-to-day lives, it always relates to the heart. What I see is then transformed to the heart. Secondly, I coveted, I wanted, I desired. One of the things that bugs me is when I hear people try to justify their actions by saying, well, I have needs. But we all got needs. And if any one of us followed those needs, then we'd have no rules and we'd have no regulations, and we just do what we want to do. But I don't know what Achan would have done with these sins. I mean, after all, what's he going to do walking around with a coat that was from the forbidden city? Everyone would have smelt a rat. But that is what sin does to us. It makes us blind to these sins. He wanted. Thirdly, we recognize that he tried to hide these sins. When a person starts to hide things, it means that there's something shameful. I remember as a young man, when I was due to get married, and someone said to me that if you ever attempt to hide something from your wife, then there's something wrong. Now, I hide something from my wife. It's called chocolates. She once found them all in my drawer. But anyway, I've found things that she's hidden from me. It's always chocolates. But there are some things that you know in your heart that if you shared that with your wife, it would be shameful. God hates sin. He doesn't just dislike it. He hates it with a holy hatred. Here comes the fourth question. What did Israel do to put that right before God? Well, first of all, they brought the sin out into the open. Look at verse 24. Then Joshua together with all Israel. In other words, the whole nation came together. It affected the people. It caused defeat. It caused disaster. It caused heartbreak. It caused pain. It even caused death. 36 men were killed as a result of this. 36 families who were broken-hearted. 36 families grieving. Therefore, this sin must be brought out into the open. That, of course, is the whole point of church discipline. No one likes church discipline. We're very good at saying, oh, I believe in church discipline. But when it comes to our friend or member of the family, oh, I don't believe in church discipline. But church discipline, when it happens, needs to be applied. And that's the point of discipline of Achan. If he allowed to remain, then Israel would have been defeated. It's the same with church discipline. If you allow sin to continue, then we will have no blessing. And the sin of Achan was brought out into the open. Secondly, we see that sin must be dealt with aggressively. They brought Achan and his family and everything that belonged to Achan in front of them, and they stoned them to death, and they burned them all. Now, some might say, well, that's a bit extreme, that's a bit harsh. Why the whole of the family? After all, it's only Achan who committed the crime, but how do we know that? Well, we don't really know that. But the point is this. Sin must be dealt with utter brutality and aggressively. If sin is allowed to remain, it will spread. It's like a bucket full of apples. If you fail to remove one bad apple, well, it will spread, and it'll be a bucket of rotten apples. And because of one man's sin, it brought disgrace and dishonor to the people of God. Remember what the Apostle Paul tells us to do. In Colossians chapter 3 and verse 5, he said, put to death, therefore, whatever belongs to your earthly nature, stone it, kill it, deal with it. I must deal with it. Israel, by this act, showed what? They showed their repentance. And we as a church here in Wigmore dare not do anything, dare not go forward until we ask the Lord to lead us and show us. That's the whole point of the week of prayer. That every one of us needs to be involved in the community, involved in the local church, and it will be by your refusal to be involved that you may be a stumbling block. If that's the case, well, get involved. The fact of the matter is that God can turn disaster, defeat into hope and victory. We see in verse 26 that God's anger no longer burned. And then you look at Joshua chapter 8 and verse 1, God assures Joshua of victory. Where there was once defeat, God gives victory. You see, God can turn things around. God can give new hope. Remember how it's put in Hosea chapter 6 and verse 1. Come, let us return to the Lord. He has torn us to pieces, but he will heal us. He has injured us, but he will bind up our wounds. The story shows how one man's sin brought shame upon the nation, but it shows how crucial repentance and dependence on the Lord. It shows us that self-examination is vital. And we have to ask ourselves, do we know where our strength comes from? Have we forgotten the promises of the Lord? Are we overconfident and complacent? Have we got too carried away with our organizations and with all our activities? Do we say with the psalmist, search me, O Lord. There's a battle ahead of us. There's a task ahead of us. There's work that needs to be done. But I dare not do this on my own ability or on my own strength. And that's why I commend this week of prayer, that as I pray and as I knock on heaven's door, my pride, my sin has to go before God blesses. May we know something of the victory that was turned from defeat. And may we all examine ourselves that we inquire of the Lord.